Well, Sunday marked the 35th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster, a nuclear accident that occurred on April the 26th, 1986, at the number 4 reactor in Chernobyl, near the city of Pripyat, North Ukraine. It is considered still to this day the worst nuclear disaster in history, both in terms of cost and casualties. But although over 3 decades ago, the lingering impact of Chernobyl in the psyche more than in the landscape is the long-lasting side effect of that disaster, to the point where even today in Australia, where we are trying to get carbon dioxide emissions down as part of the energy mix, and we have a very rich uranium deposit, particularly in South Australia, there are many who simply say, remember Chernobyl, let's not go nuclear. So powerful were those events 3 decades and a half on. Somebody who understands the Chernobyl site back the front is Rob Maxwell. He is a contemporary archaeologist, but has a particular interest in the site at Chernobyl, and in fact has been, as part of his work, to Pripyat. And he joins us on the line. Rob, nice to talk with you.
Lovely to talk to you.
Tell me, when you went to Pripyat all those years ago, what were you confronted with?
Well, I was confronted with a really unique landscape. It is one of those places in the world that really hits you not only visually, but right in the guts, because it's recognizable to most of us. You know, a lot of the buildings within the Chernobyl exclusion zone were built in the 20th century, so there's supermarkets and there's cinemas and there's traffic lights and pedestrian crossings. But it's completely dead and seemingly void of life. And you get this really fascinating snapshot of a moment in time, a moment in the 1980s that we've since moved on from. And to me, it had the same effect as walking into a site like Pompeii, where all of a sudden people have just dropped their cups and saucers and left. And what we have is a 1980s version of that.
Just snap frozen. Now, I described you as a contemporary archaeologist, but you spend a lot of your time digging around these sort of nuclear places. What does an archaeologist do at a radioactive site?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting question. Contemporary archaeology really is the most radical modern extension of the discipline, I would tend to say, because we work in environments that most archaeologists would either consider off limits, outside of our scope, or unable to be studied. And so for, say, my colleague Alice Gorman, she is a space archaeologist and studies orbiting heritage. And for me, I deal with sites of abandonment. And so in places like Chernobyl and Fukushima, that abandonment is nuclear in origin. And so what we do is look at the site as it has been left above ground as a snapshot in time, as a moment in time, and the arrangement of those objects next to each other and their relationship to the different structures and ephemera of the site really tell you what happened on the ground on the day in question. And that's something that you can't get from video and you can't get from photography. You can really only get from studying the material culture on the ground. And the only difference between what we do and what you would consider a historical or classical archaeologist does is that we don't need to dig most of the time. The stuff that we're finding is often above ground. And in my case, in radioactive context, you really can't touch anything for health reasons. So you have to study it in a very, very hands-off way.
I'd imagine so. One of the other challenges, no doubt, with studying the detail of a site like Chernobyl is that at the time the politics involved often got in the way of telling the truth. I wanted to ask you, from your study, a lot of people are very worried about nuclear technology, even today, and they all point back to 1986. But how much of what happened at Chernobyl, the disaster, was the fault of technology as opposed to the fault of politics?
Yeah, well, I mean, that really does get the crux of what my study is about, because the events of the Chernobyl disaster were immediately immediately and directly caused by state pressure, by pressure to run a test that the physicists in the control room on the night knew was unsafe, but because of Soviet plant management pressure, they had to run the test, and that is what caused the disaster. So what you have really is a keen example of what happens when political ideology reaches its most extreme, which is when you try to enforce it upon the physics of the atom. But also, it really shows how one accident in the early phase of a technology can tarnish the name of that technology for generations to come. And we've come a long way since the events of 1986, and we've had a lot of different nuclear incidents and accidents around the world, not only Fukushima, but 3 Mile Island, Sellafield, all over the place. And we now understand the technology a lot better and have better ways of harnessing radioactive sources of fuel. Thorium salt reactors are a really good example. And so, unfortunately, Chernobyl has tarnished an entire potentially very clean energy source for our country unnecessarily. But that's the power of inference, and that's the power of culture and the reiteration of a myth.
Just before you go, back to Pripyat and Chernobyl itself, after the reactor meltdown, eventually there was a 30-kilometre exclusion zone imposed, was there not? And I think at the time Pripyat had a population of just under 50,000, about 49,000 people. They had to be evacuated. And I guess I'm right in saying human life has not returned in any sense since.
Well, it has, in a sense, it has. The interesting things that have come out of my study are particularly that the human level of interaction with that landscape never really stopped because there was a Ukrainian military presence within the exclusion zone all the way through the 1990s. And it was known for a fact during my field work that one of the administration buildings in the middle of Pripyat had a working television until 1995. And so there has been a human presence in terms of the military and resettlers in the zone who were often elderly and chose of their own accord to come back and work on their own land again and essentially gamble with it. But by and large, it is a very, very big, interesting nature preserve where you will see European wild hogs and black bears and deer and geese flying overhead in formation and voles and you name it, it's all returned to the zone in droves. So it's this really fascinating picture in contrast where it's a site of human devastation and psychological trauma, but it's also a site of natural regeneration and a glimpse at what Europe looked like before human interaction even began.
And indeed, when you went there all those years ago, you made the point, didn't you, that the most dangerous thing that you encountered there was a wild boar.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it was widely known at the time when I did my first season of field work that the wild boars were really quite dangerous and weren't scared of humans at all, and that if you got between one, say a mother and her offspring, that was a very bad situation. And so one of the potential titles for my PhD was actually If You See Pig, Climb Tree, because that was precisely what was told to me.
Well, we've given grants to stranger things, so, you know.
Oh, well, very true. And so I said, but aren't the trees radioactive? And I said, yes, they are. And I said, well, isn't that a problem? And they said, well, the tree won't gore you. So, it really is a fascinating place where you could equally find a wild boar or some other type of European wildlife foraging away in the middle of a former street. or you could find a stack of clothes that were taken off by a liquidator in a hurry because he was too radioactive one day in 1986. It's a fascinating place. It's incredible.
Fascinating indeed. And fascinating to talk to you. Thank you so much for your
it's always
time, Rob.
good.
Really appreciate
My
it.
absolute pleasure. My absolute pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure. Rob Maxwell there, contemporary archaeologist from the University of Sydney.